First off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Matt Haynes, and I'm on staff at the North Carolina Study Center, who is one of the co-hosts of this event tonight, along with InterVarsity graduate and faculty ministries. Where is Hank Carlton? Wait from Hank. So Hank is the longtime director of InterVarsity graduate and faculty ministries at UNC, who's our co-sponsor tonight. So thank you, Hank, and welcome to faculty who are with us. We love getting to host events like this that bring together students, current students, undergrad, grad students, faculty, community members, alumni. It's a joy just to see so many different parts of the Carolina community come together. I've been on staff at the Study Center for, this is my 6th year now. And I remember when I came on staff in 2016 to help with education and programming, I remember talking to Madison about dream speakers, like who, if we could invite anyone from anywhere, who would we have speak at the Study Center at UNC? And I remember Dr. Nathan Hatch being at the top of that list. However, Dr. Hatch was a little bit preoccupied and has been for the last 16 years as the president of Wake Forest University just down the road. So when Dr. Hatch retired last summer, we thought maybe now is our time. Maybe we can get Dr. Hatch, and we were very fortunate to have him with us and to get to host him tonight. Dr. Roper will introduce Dr. Hatch in just a moment. I did want to share just a little bit about run of show for tonight and format. So we'll have Madison Perry, our executive director, and Dr. Hatch on stage for an interview. We'll hear from Dr. Hatch on a wide variety of topics, Christian leadership within pluralistic institutions, the state of American higher education, reasons for optimism, pessimism, both, and his reflections as a scholar of American Christianity and church history, reflections on today. So lots to look forward to. I think Madison and Dr. Hatch will probably be up here for about 45 minutes in interview format, but we want to leave plenty of time at the end for audience interaction and audience Q&A. So just make mental notes as the evening goes on, flag that burning question you have, and then we will have a mic runner at the end. If you just raise your hand, we can bring you the mic and you'll have a chance to interact. We also want to give a welcome to our Zoom crowd tonight. Thank you, Andrew Board from our staff, who's helping oversee our AV needs. We have, I think, about 40 folks who have registered on Zoom. So welcome to everyone who's there. And if you have a question tonight, please submit it through Zoom, and we'll also get to questions from our virtual audience. So thank you again for being with us. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic to Dr. Bill Roper, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Matt, and good evening, everybody. I'm Bill Roper, for those of you that haven't met. I'm a faculty member here in medicine and public health, and I'm a board member of Study Center, and I'm pleased on behalf of the whole Study Center team to welcome you to this event this evening. And it's my duty, my happy duty, to introduce our guest speaker, Nathan Hatch.
That I spent in leadership at UNC Chapel Hill were almost exactly the same years that he was president of Wake Forest, 2005 to 2021. Dr. Hatch is an eminent historian of American religion. One of the things that is notable about him is he wrote a book about 30 years ago, The Democratization of American Christianity, that it was picked a few years ago by about 2,000 historians and sociologists as one of the 2 most important books of American history of religion in our nation. So I learned that yesterday. I downloaded it on Kindle and I read it yesterday and today. So it's a great book, I promise you that. Dr. Hatch is a native of Columbia, South Carolina, went to Wheaton College, then got his master's and PhD in history at Washington University in St. Louis, did postdoc fellowships at Harvard and Hopkins, and he was on the faculty at Notre Dame, a Protestant at Notre Dame, and after 20 years or so became the provost, the #2 position at Notre Dame, and did that for about a decade, and then was lured to Winston-Salem as the president of Wake Forest. His time there has been really consequential. Under his leadership, Wake Forest rose in its national ranking to be the number 23rd national university in the country, voted on by their peers. He did a number of things that are notable beyond that. I was well acquainted with the important work he did changing and reforming and improving the Wake Forest Baptist health system, a major complicated task. And he was also involved in big time college athletics on NCAA committees and so on. I promise you that this is the first tie that I have worn in about 9 months. And I just went to my closet believing that Dr. Hatch was going to wear a tie. I thought if I'm going to introduce him, I need to have a tie on. And I went to the closet and found my tie rack, and I just picked a color at random. I don't know whether anybody notices the color and its importance, but go Tar Heels. We're glad to have you, Dr. Hatch. Thank you for being here.
We're going to try to speak into the mic for our Zoom audience. Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here. I was just remembering that our last time in this room, we had Dr. Jamie Smith in February of 2020 to talk about his book, You Are What You Love, and how Christians can be properly ambitious. And the day before Dr. Smith came to the event, we had fires roaring at the event itself. He almost didn't come because he was sick that day. So it's good to see everybody's appropriately spaced today. Dr. Hatch, it's great to have you. It was, I had a friend meet you just a second ago, and he didn't know what you had done and kind of what your role was at Wake Forest. And I thought maybe a good way to begin tonight would be for you to maybe walk us through what put you in academia in the first place, and at what point you decided that administration was a call that you had.
In some ways, just live. Hello? Now it is. Great. In some ways, I've had at least 2 careers because I'd never planned to be an administrator. I was always passionate about history from an 8th grade class that I took. I studied history in college and wanted to go to graduate school. I remember as I left, I took the law exam in case doctoral work didn't work out, but it did. And I studied early American history and got a position teaching at Notre Dame. And my goal for a decade was to be a really fine historian, to be a great teacher, to publish, to excel at the academic life. And then one day, it was 2 weeks before class started, I got a call one night from someone who was then chair of the philosophy department. He said, "Nathan, can you come over to my house?" I mean, this is 10 o'clock at night. Michael was an impulsive person. I did that, and he had just been named dean of the college, and he said, "Would you come work as an associate dean?" And he said, "You've got 2 days to decide. I want to announce the team." He said, "Come try it for a couple of years." So that's how I started in administration. For many years, then I balanced administration, teaching, research, and eventually found that I think my greatest passion, I love teaching, I love doing history, but I also love building institutions. And so it was, the move to administration was gradual. And in a sense, in some ways people kept saying, take the next job. So it was taking that opportunity.
And as an institution builder, as a university builder, what would you say is kind of the call of the university, and what does the university do, and how does an administrator help do that?
I mean, the university is a community of people, faculty, students, other important staff. It's a community of learning. It's a wonderful thing. University, college and university are the oldest institutions in our society, save for the church. And we hope they'll be here in another 100 years. And to see the sort of magic of education go on is a wonderful thing. And so I'm not a very good administrator. I'm not given to detail. But I did from the time actually my first job in administration, Mike Lux, I said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "I don't know."
He said, we have someone doing the budget and undergraduate advising and this and that. He said, but I know there's a lot we're not doing. Go figure that out. And that was a wonderful job. And we started major faculty development programs, but it was, how do we recruit the best faculty? How do we empower them to make them better scholars and teachers? And sort of seeing the fruits of that, investing in people, it was life-giving for me.
And when you think about kind of the different positions on what a university is here to do, is it here to train a person for a job or to develop character or to change the world? How do you kind of parse those various aims of a university?
I mean, I do think, a generation ago, a majority of students would go to college to find a philosophy of life, and those numbers have just receded. We've become much more pragmatic and professional in orientation. Part of that is understandable in that it's much harder to get a job. When I graduated from college, you could sort of major in anything, and then jobs were there. That's no longer the case. But by the same token, education, I think, suffers if it's too pragmatic. It's at Wake, we've tried to, it's very much a liberal arts institution. We've invested heavily in career services, personal and career development, not to take away from liberal arts, but to allow students to study what they're passionate about with one hand, and then also, so I can major in classics, but then if I want to be an investment banker, or I can study art, but then think of going into design. So I do think higher education is weakened if it gets away from asking the big questions and something that educates people for life.
And as president of Wake Forest University, I mean, it's a school with people from different faiths and no faith, and you identify as a Christian and have Christian values. And how did you kind of make sense of leading a pluralistic university as a Christian?
I think in the current moment, polarism is a terrible issue, but sometimes I think it's overdone. I mean, what I've found throughout my experience that most faculty and most students are of goodwill and have more in common than they do difference. And that's particularly true if you treat people with respect, with honesty, with transparency, if you solve real problems, if you build teams, and you listen to different points of view. And so, in a sense, coming to Wake Forest has a religious tradition, although it is now, it's not church related. Actually, the trustees there were interested in how sort of the life of the Spirit could be revived, but in a pluralistic context. And so during that time, I certainly supported all kinds of campus ministry. 25% of our students at Wake Forest now are Catholic, so we supported that. We also have a Jewish chaplain, a Muslim chaplain. And so, in a sense, respecting the kind of diversity. I can remember early on there was some complaint from non-Christian students. In our student center, there was a meditation chapel that was distinctly Christian. They said, this is not fair, we feel uncomfortable. And our answer to that was, no, we're not going to change that, but we're going to have another more neutral meditation room. And that sort of strategy, I think, has worked well. So certainly there are times when there's serious disagreements, but people today are also hungry. They're hungry to get along. People are lonely. And I've found if one can lead with humility, with teamwork, sometimes I've found you actually win by losing. That is, you listen, you change your mind. Somebody has a better idea, or someone corrects you, or in a couple of cases, you actually concede something in order to build trust. And I think, at least I have found in a pluralistic environment, that posture actually is deeply appreciated. So I mean, there were a lot of people I disagreed with. They sort of knew from where I came, but I think they had an element of trust and that I played fairly. I mean, it was true. When I went there, I think our LGBTQ community, there was a lot of prejudice. We started a center. I mean, the director of that, she and I had an interesting relationship. She knew what my personal religious background was. We always didn't agree, but there was an element of trust and understanding.
That's a good example. And I'm so used now to seeing people try to create monocultures where everybody has the exact same presuppositions and first principles. Can you say more about kind of a Christian argument for why is it good to have diversity of thought in an educational environment?
Well, I do think it makes everyone stronger, particularly people of belief. That is, their ideas are challenged. It's not just an accepted culture, and that certainly is. I think that makes the faith stronger. And so, I mean, I guess my approach to leadership. I didn't start as an administrator with a well worked out philosophy, but over time, I came to say you hire very strong people, and then you build teams. And it's the different perspectives of a team that strengthen the overall institution. I'll give an example of that. I guess when I went to Wake, I was interested in enhancing things like vocation and character and academic quality. We hired a very talented provost, a woman named Jill Tiefenthaler. She had been at Colgate, and she's gone on. She was with us 4 years. She became president of Colorado College. She's now CEO of National Geographic. She is a wonderful leader. She had very different interests. She had interests in diversity. She was an economist of education. For instance, she launched the whole thing of going test optional well over a decade ago before anyone had done it. So everyone has moved, almost everyone has moved in that direction. But by the combined leadership of Jill and yours truly, I think created a stronger Wake Forest than if it had only been my best ideas.
And can you say something about how your background from Wheaton and as a scholar of religion, did that have any impact on how you function as an administrator on your goals?
Yeah. I think I learned at Wheaton that piety and the life of the mind were fully compatible, and that actually study was a good gift of God, and that those were not incompatible. And the faculty at Wheaton certainly opened to me to explore the modern world from a Christian perspective, to be sure. But in a sense, that study was a good thing. At a place like Wheaton, I think the broader purposes of education just were in the water. They were part of the culture. Faculty committed to students. The point was to educate the whole person, not just what you learned. It was, what do you think about your purposes are in life? Tremendous opportunities for service. I spent one summer in Chicago living in an African-American church. As someone who had come from the South, this was an eye-opening experience. And so I think I sort of learned, I think, and imbibed some of the core purposes of education.
And what would you say is the relationship between your inner piety and your scholarly background? How have you been able to keep your scholarly background fresh, and how have you been able to keep your faith vibrant?
I mean, I think I've been blessed with a wonderful wife who keeps me sane. I've been blessed to be a part of strong churches. When I was in St. Louis in graduate school, when I was at Notre Dame in a Christian Reformed church, and in Winston-Salem at the First Presbyterian Church. So Christian communities. I was blessed early as a historian. There was a group of Christian historians who started meeting every summer. And some of you may know Grant Wacker or George Marsden or Mark Knoll. There were about a dozen of us, and we started meeting every summer with our families. And by having people who were good in their fields, and we'd criticize each other, read each other's work, but at the same time, there were people of faith, and our families were close. This was a tremendous blessing.
And as your president, were there things that you would have done at a Christian college that you didn't do at Wake Forest?
I mean, it's a different framework, and I think it's one of the great things about American higher education. It is so diverse. It's unlike anywhere in the world. It's not like Europe or Latin America, where education is principally a function of the state or of the church. Here, it's private, it's entrepreneurial. And so you have all kinds of colleges, and you have distinctly religious colleges. If I had been president of an evangelical college, I still would have worked on some critical things. How do you hire the very best faculty? And how do you get the very best students? And I would have pushed hard on both of those fronts. You know, an interesting model is, I don't know if you know the way that Brigham Young is structured, but the Latter-day Saints are very shrewd about education. So Brigham Young is a very large university. I think it has about 25,000 students. But it costs almost nothing to go there. The church itself pumps about $500 million a year into supporting Brigham Young. And the point is, they want to recruit the best students to have that education. And then they're also very shrewd at sending them on to graduate work. In fact, I think they may, I don't know what the figures are, but they're among the highest percentage of students who go on for doctoral work. So I'm not, I'm just making the point. It's a very shrewd approach to higher education. And I think I actually spoke to the Wheaton board a couple of years ago. My point to them was people used to go to college or university often in religious tracks. Presbyterians would go to Davidson, evangelicals would go to a place like Wheaton, Methodists would go to Duke. I said, all of that is no longer works. And talented people will go to a place like Chapel Hill or Duke or Stanford or Harvard. And actually, it's a much better place because you have things like this center. It's a much healthier place for Christians at pluralist universities. So my point to them is if a place like Wheaton or Calvin is going to prosper, they have to be much more active in convincing students of why they should come there rather than elsewhere.
We often have incoming students coming through right now. We often also have admitted students. And a lot of the families that we're finding out about the students from, they're families that are also interested in Wheaton or a number of religious colleges. And we'll try to provide an argument for why a student can get a great Christian education at UNC and an education in general, and then also to try to avail them of Christian resources that would kind of complete a Christian educational experience. Can you say more about what it would look like for us to do our job well in Chapel Hill as a study center?
I mean, I do think a center like this is a great place for Christians on a campus to meet, that kind of networking, particularly on a large campus like Chapel Hill. It's a great place to hold events, discussions, forums, lectures that bring people together. I mean, I can see offering classes or seminars on given things in that there's certain kinds of classes you would get at a Christian college that you don't get here. But for all those reasons, I think this and a number of study centers that have sprung up at distinguished universities is a great encouragement.
One question that we have as we meet students at Carolina, and we're hoping to have a great educational experience, they come in really driven by a career, and it's like a part of their intellectual curiosity has kind of dissipated over the course of high school or COVID, who knows. What kind of advice do you have to a student who doesn't yet know what they want to do and who's just coming to college and because it's the next thing to do?
I mean, I think it's good to take a wide range of subjects to see what they really are interested in, what they're passionate about. And I think it's good if you don't have to specialize too early. In certain fields you do, but even then, in technical fields where you sort of have to start from day one, to take as wide a range of courses as you can. I think back of a simple course in music appreciation that I took as a college student, introductory course, that has framed my whole view of classical music and why I love to go to the symphony to this day. And it's that kind of breadth. And then sometimes you will find that a subject that you haven't studied before becomes a real passion.
I'd like to hear more about your career trajectory and sort of the role that ambition played in it, and how, as a person of faith, you cope with ambition as a leader.
I think if I've wrestled with anything in my life, it's ambition, because it's very complicated. On the one hand, ambition seems the opposite of what the call of Christ is to be a servant, and the first shall be last and the last first. I've also learned that you can't completely squelch ambition. In one sense, ambition is a God-given gift. And so it's how you channel it, how you scrutinize it. Abraham Lincoln, his law partner, William Herndon, said, he was a very ambitious person. He said it was like his ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. And Lincoln said at one point, when he wasn't very successful in the 1840s, he said, I just wanted to make a difference in the world. And that's a wonderful thing. But how that is channeled, and one way I think about it, I love the Jim Collins' book, From Good to Great, which studies successful companies over time, successful leaders over time. He says there are two things about those that are sustained over time. And this is a secular study of secular institutions. He said one is passion, just that drive, that sheer ambition. The second, he says, is humility. And by humility, he means, is the ambition personal for the promotion of a person, or is it directed towards the promotion of the company or the common good? And it seems to me it's a wonderful way to test your own ambition. I recall Jonathan Reckford, who's a wonderful graduate of this institution, tells the story. He ran for the student body president here, and he said he thought he had the position to win it, and he lost. And he said he was crushed. And his aunt, I think, was Millicent Fenwick, a wonderful senator, a Republican senator from New Jersey. And he went to talk to her. And he said, she asked him a pointed question, why did you want that office? And he said, I had no answer. And that taught him a lot about ambition. What's the thing that you want to do? And so it's ambition is important. It's dangerous. And I think one other word of advice, make sure with your friends and colleagues that people reflect on your own ambitions, because it's too easy to cross the line, to think your ambitions are worthy when they're not, or when they're mixed.
And kind of as you do run with the ambition, what advice do you have for turning it off and resting on occasion? How does that look for you?
Well, I'll tell a funny story. When I actually had gotten into administration, And I had not finished the book that became Democratization. And the person who brought me into administration, he knew this. And so for a given year, he said, Nathan, you've got to finish that book. And so why don't you work on it every morning and then come do administration that afternoon? So for that year, Julie and I, my wife, said this was going to be the blitz. We had a young family. And so I cut off most other involvements. And I would go home at night, get the children to bed, and then I'd come back and work a couple hours. This was the year blitz. Later on, Julie would reflect, somehow the year of blitz never ended. So it is, somehow it's harder to cut it off when you're doing important, meaningful things. But I do think the idea of Sabbath is very important. And there's a writer, Judith Shulevitz, who's Jewish, who's written a whole book about this. And she had also a wonderful New York Times article where she, as a secular Jew, found her life tasteless. It was too much on the treadmill of success. And she went back to start honoring the Sabbath. Not just to have time off, but to escape from the pressure of achievement. And she writes very compellingly about that, but I think it's good for all of us, though, particularly those who are, as you're, whether it's in school or a young professional or a senior person where you're under pressure, somehow to be able to get out from under it. I would not give myself as an example of someone who's necessarily done that successfully, but that certainly is the ideal.
The phrase "a tasteless life" is a powerful one. Yeah. Was there a book that you didn't publish or a thesis that you wanted to prove in a book that you never got around to because you were occupied otherwise?
I don't think there was anything that I was passionate about publishing. I worked a long time on the democratization book because I thought it was an interpretation of American history that the more I studied the sources, the more I thought it was right and sort of a story that needed to be told. So I can't think of their individual biographies or studies that I might have done, but not a big project.
And as an historian of American Christianity, what would be some of the things that stick out to you about our present moment?
I mean, in some ways, the themes that I wrote about in that book continue to be so evident. That is, in America, religion has not been left to elites, not been left to just educated people. We have denominations and movements and preachers who arise seemingly from nowhere and command audiences, and that whole tradition continues. In fact, with the decline of denominations, it may be even more powerful. And I think you see the same thing in political life, the decline of sort of populist understandings. People rise to the occasion who aren't experts, but who are able to connect with common people and use rhetoric that has that kind of appeal. And so that sort of populist streak in American history, I'm surprised in the last 20 years how much that's taken hold and transformed much of our politics, but it's still very evident in religious life with the decline of mainline denominations.
And I know that you're not a pastor and you're not leading the congregation right now, but if you were, what would be one message that you would want to make sure to give?
I find a lot of evangelical Christianity today, frankly, shallow and human-centered. And I wish there were more attention to mystery and wonder and what God is doing, not what we should or could do. I saw a clip recently from Eugene Peterson, whose work has influenced me in significant ways. And he said this, and it really struck home. He said, the thing I anticipate most in a sermon is charisma, that God is doing something that has never been done before. I'm listening for proclamation of what God is doing. If the pastor is mostly talking about what I'm doing, I quit listening. Moralistic sermons are non-gospel. It puts everything on us. I want to enter the world of Abraham, Jonah, Jesus. I want to hear what is going on, not just verbatim of what went on then, but what God is doing now. Preaching is about what God is doing and doing now, and I'm looking for charisma. And I do think that there's a kind of flatness of what we can do that so in some ways I wish we would return to sort of classic evangelical orthodoxy, Puritans, Edwards. I think there are a lot of people that do that, but I think we need more of it. It's an interesting, I'll tell a story of two classmates of mine, class of '68 from Wheaton, Mark Knoll and John Piper. In college, neither of them were very religious. They had grown up in a fundamentalist background, and they got to college and they wanted to learn. They were deeply involved in English and philosophy. But I knew them both, and piety, going to church, religious things, that they were doing other things. Both of them had dramatic experiences after college. Mark Knoll has said it may have been his conversion when he started reading Martin Luther and the sort of deep God-centered sense of what Christianity was. John Piper had a similar move when he went to Fuller Seminary, and Dan Fuller introduced him to Jonathan Edwards. He had a similar kind of powerful experience. I say that just because it's, if there's one message that the contemporary church could hear, it's that.
Thank you. It was a dangerous question to ask, but you did really well. We've covered a lot of topics. We've covered higher ed. We've covered administration. We've covered leadership. We've talked some about Christianity in America. So there's plenty of fodder, and I imagine the audience has more questions. Matt, do you have a roving mic, or should I give you mine when it's time? I'd love to hear some of what y'all are thinking, and I have a couple more questions if I need to pitch in more. So anybody with a question, please raise your hand. And
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, so I'll be Mike Runner. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I see Joshua first. We'll start here. Keep it to a question. 1 to 2 sentences.
What do you think is in the setting of the university, as we're thinking about trying to limit tuition growth and sort of having limited funds, what is the balance between trying to support areas of the university that provide more economic gains, such as many of the sciences, STEM fields, versus still continuing to support the liberal arts and that sort of thing? And how do you sort of make those decisions between how much do you follow where students are having economic outcomes versus sort of preserving this and supporting these traditional areas of study in the institution?
I mean, I think in principle, it's important to sustain both sides of the coin. The STEM fields as well, the more humanistic kinds of learning. It becomes harder in tuition-driven institutions if the one shrinks. And I think that's what you see in many. I think it's imperative on humanistic faculties to make courses interesting and dynamic. I mean, and some have argued because of the move into certain kinds of critical theory or whatever, that in a sense, the studies say of English is just less interesting. And so it behooves, I know at Wake Forest, one would be concerned about like a field like classics. But what's happened, we have 3 young classicists that are really dynamic. And so classics has a good number of majors that faculty attract. It seems to me that's the, you can't just assume, you're going to have to interest students in those humanistic fields.
Great. Another question, Jack.
In some ways almost connected to the previous one in terms of resources, but connected also to your answer in terms of getting the people. What have you learned about incentivizing and rewarding people in a context where, unlike most of society wants the reward to be financial reward if they're going to report it in the newspaper or something?
So I don't quite understand the question. What?
Yeah, so as a university administrator, you can't always give people financial rewards for things. What have you learned as a university administrator about rewarding people in the context of the university?
Yeah. I talked about that first administrative job I had, and we set up this Institute for Faculty Development. And one of the things we came to is, how can we recognize and appreciate faculty? And we had a team that really worked on that. When people would publish things, we would recognize them. We hired a faculty research consultant. I mean, in the sciences, sort of getting grants, getting time off is sort of built into the profession. Not so much so in the humanities. We had a consultant to help people do this. And so to the extent that you can reach out and the institution provide all kinds of help. Now, as in an undergraduate institution, I think there are all kinds of teaching and learning centers. There are all kinds of ways that you do that. But I think institution has a deep responsibility to say, how do you help the people here thrive and sort of become the best student or faculty member that they can be? And that's apart from, it may take some money to set up the program, but that's apart from rewarding people with money per se.
All right, Parker, we've got an undergrad question.
So you talked about hiring strong leaders for your teams. Where did you see at Wake Forest undergrad students, like places where they're learning to grow to be strong leaders and like learn those skills and traits as undergrad students?
It's a great question. I think there are many ways to do that. I think student organizations are a wonderful way to do that. I think athletics is a great way to do that. I mean, we have a new program at Wake in leadership and character that its courses does deal with leadership, but in some ways it's subversive, because it's basically saying, how do you be a leader of character? It's not how you become a self-promoter. But I think it takes time. At least by the time I finished undergraduate or even a doctorate, I'm not sure, I didn't know fully my gifts. I think you have to have some patience. I mean, my advice, a Wake grad from Charlotte told me, she was at a group of her friends recently, and they all worked in banks. They were all young professionals in Charlotte. So many were unhappy in their jobs. It's part of that's understandable. I mean, you're the lowest person on the totem pole. I mean, my advice is your first job is probably not that interesting. Actually, when I started teaching, I mean, my first couple of years, and since they were terrible, I was not sleeping much. It was tremendous pressure. I had this dominant chair of the department. He was a powerful figure. And he just said, he didn't give me the day. He said, I'll just drop by your class sometime. I mean, this was really intimidating. So in a sense, first jobs often aren't fun. My advice is don't look beyond that. Do well at what you're assigned to do, because your opportunities for the future will come because you've done superbly at that job.
That's good advice. Others? Yes, we've got a faculty question now from Don.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hatch. This has been wonderful to hear your wisdom and to share it with us. I have more of a general question. You mentioned Mark Knoll. I've read several of his books and also from Philip Jenkins about the global church. And we're aware of how much the global church is growing. Our daughter's involved with campus ministry. Has come across with the same feeling like, well, there's so much we can learn from the global church. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if what the global church has to offer, or now what's called, I guess, the majority church, how can we, what would be a good way, a mechanism of bringing that wisdom and that difference in our Christianity and their Christianity that we could learn from, bringing it to a university campus, whether it's secular or religious school. That's one of my real interests right now, is learning from the global church and not bottling it up, but sharing it with so many people. Thank you.
I mean, I don't have any ready answers for that. I mean, one idea, there are so many, at least in American cities, there's so many enclaves of internationals who are in this country practicing their Christianity. They often form churches. I mean, to, in a sense, bring some of those people to campus. And probably a place like Chapel Hill, there are graduate students and others who come from the third world that could be brought in for discussion and interaction.
Great. We've got another undergrad question from Edie.
During your college career, what actions did you take that you feel were most impactful to your work in Christian leadership, or your outlook on Christian leadership?
What actions did I take when I was in college?
Yes.
You know, I was a little bit of a bookworm. I mean, I was passionate about studying. I did certain things of service. I had to work when I was in college. I made really good friends, but by the time I left college, I didn't know if or what kind of leader I was. I mean, I can remember, yeah, I think it takes time. I think in addition to the formal courses, some of the most valuable things I had was bright students and just, you know, talking late into the night, trying to clarify what I believed, who I was. But be patient with yourself. It's not going to all be clear by the time you graduate from college.
All right, we've got a Zoom question from our online audience. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew here. This question comes from Stuart Davenport.
So he refers to what he calls the evangelical intellectual renaissance from the 90s. So Dr. Knoll, Dr. Marsden, and yourself, others. Just curious if you could reflect on that and in what ways you think that movement kind of succeeded, and if there are any particular ways that you think it that it failed or could have done better.
I do think in in that time period, you did have a number of Christians who moved beyond a parochial evangelical world into more mainline universities. And they wrote more for university presses. And I think the most dominant influence is what happened in philosophy with people like Al Plantinga, Nick Wolderstorff, and scores of young professors across the country now following in their wake. I mean, this whole group of historians, of which I was privileged to be a part, I think had less, but had a certain impact. And so I do think there was that, there was a certain renaissance. But I must say there's also the sort of glacial direction of secularization. And so I'm not sure how to put that in a big picture. Yeah.
All right, this is another undergrad question from Justin.
So when you were the president of Wake, how did you manage in the midst of conflict, your zeal for the Lord, and just various like opposing or differing opinions on what would go on in campus or things that didn't necessarily look like Christianly on campus?
Yeah.
Like, how did you manage in the moment with the people who were in front of you?
I mean, I think it starts with how people are treated. And I think setting a tone where you treat people right. I mean, with me, it started with senior administrators. How are they treated? Were they flourishing? If they're angry and upset, they probably aren't going to spread goodwill in their respective spheres. And to be able to take a measure of that. So found out really how people are doing. But then I think at a place like Wake, at most places, I mean, we're there for the sake of students. And so take the temperature and take the temperature of those who may feel, who most have the most trouble connecting. I mean, in our case, it had to do with say, African-American students. And to do what you can to try to make them feel at home. It seems to me that's, it's just critically important. And so, you know, that didn't take overt Christian form, but I think it's, in my own case, it sprang from deep Christian conviction. It's interesting. In talks I would give, I actually did give one sermon at Wake Forest. I gave a lot of talks, but I tended to give talks on things that in some ways sprang from my deepest beliefs. Over time, I gave a talk on the lure of success, on being deliberate. I gave a talk on ambition, the art of conversation, teamwork, gratitude, eye contact. One that I think got the strongest response, it was a graduation talk. I called it both and. It was basically, are you really looking empathetically at both sides of an argument? Gave a talk on hospitality. So all those, in a sense, you could say they're secular virtues, but my interest in them was in the formation of students, and sort of it grows out of my deep Christian conviction. Even though one didn't have to be a Christian to value those things.
We got one on the couch here. From William.
As a leader yourself, do you have a favorite book on leadership that you would recommend for people to read?
I think the Jim Collins, From Good to Great, Because it's an empirical study of not leadership in companies that start strong and then collapses. It's what is sustained over time and what's the character of those leaders. And I found it absolutely astounding that in such a study, one of his two central themes is what he calls humility. And I do think, leadership is based on trust. So actually, I would say to undergraduates, if you're involved in leadership, you have to be yourself. Don't try to play a role, because people see right through that. I remember when I started teaching, I tried to teach like my graduate advisor, who was a brilliant teacher. And for about 6 weeks, I really floundered. And I was trying to write out lectures, but I was trying to be like him. And so actually, the light dawned on the day when I was teaching 3 classes. I had like half an hour to prepare for this whole lecture to 120 students. And all I could do was write an outline. And I went in and just talked. And suddenly, that was probably the best class of the so far, because I connected. So I had to, it's an example, you have to have your own style. One of the finest academic leaders I know is chair of a department at Notre Dame. He would never take the air out of a room. If he got up and talked, it might be slow and halting. He was a brilliant leader of that department, and he worked by relating to people. He built a great faculty if he thought someone should come on, he would go person by person to convince them. But that was his style, and he led this department just brilliantly over a decade. So you need, it seems to me, I would say the first criteria of leadership is being yourself, being comfortable with yourself. And actually, one further thing, a consulting company did a study several years ago of whether intelligence was correlated with leadership, and it's not. What is correlated is self-knowledge. That is, if you understand who you are and can accept that, then you can you can have other people who are strong in areas that you are weak.
Got a faculty question from Dr. Molly Worthen. For all the undergrads in the room, when Dr. Hatch talks about excellent humanities professors, Dr. Worthen is one of them. So you should take her classes. Here's the mic.
Thank you for the plug, Matt. I appreciate that. I've been thinking about the earlier question that you got about the evangelical renaissance in higher education, and how maybe a second chapter in that story is connected to some of the challenges in higher education, more broadly speaking. And what I mean is this: it seems to me that in recent years, there has been a quite open, vehement rift, or at least a lot of conflict between your generation of historians and younger evangelical historians. I recall vividly sitting in on a church history panel, which was populated by some of these younger scholars like Jamar Tisby and Kristen Dumais. And their message was, it has been a huge mistake to define evangelicalism theologically, to dwell on the Bevington Quadrilateral, to use this sort of majority white, very reformed framework for defining evangelicalism. And in fact, Christian scholars have to really face fully the degree to which racial prejudice, sexism, all of these things have to be much more prominent in the history. And that particular conversation, I mean, Mark Knoll and I think Joe Carpenter were in the audience. I mean, it's Mark Knoll, so he never gets heated, right? But he was very measured, but it was really tense. And I was thinking about that in the context of some of the fissures and failures to communicate and perceptions of bad faith that I see in higher ed right now, and a sort of crisis of confidence that especially we in the humanities have, that we no longer feel we can talk in terms of universal values, what would be the equivalent of theology in a secular university, that really it is only valid to talk about identity groups and to talk about human particularities. It almost seems to parallel this conversation that's happening among Christian historians across the generations. And I wonder how you see this conversation unfolding, both in the discipline, but also in higher ed, and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about maybe a future where we could have a kind of synthesis, or we could have a both and.
Yeah. No, I see your critique. I mean, in a sense, I agree with it. And I think in the last 25 years, attention to other groups, to minorities, is a very healthy corrective. And it certainly was a lot of that was ignored by my generation. Now, I think there is an issue now that I think it's hard for young faculty to study anything but that. You know, I was talking to a doctoral student in American history the other day, and it's swung so much that it's healthy, but it also I think can be problematic. But I mean, I should say on balance, I am not pessimistic about the academy, despite its problems. I think the press, even something like the Chronicle of Higher Education, basically tells bad news. And so you have someone who shouted down at Yale, and that it's one incident, and that becomes the news story for a week. And when I look at the institutions I know, whether it's Notre Dame or whether it's Wake Forest, or when I'm counseling a couple of other presidents at liberal arts colleges, what's going on day in and day out is very positive. And granted, there's a decline in the humanities, but I'm not pessimistic. And even in terms of academic disciplines, I think the kind of issues being addressed by younger historians are needed and helpful. And you know, if I had to write democratization again, I would have to do it quite differently. But that's, you know, that's the way knowledge advances.
All right, we've got another faculty question from Dr. Lensing, who is emeritus in the English department.
I think we all know that the number of churchgoers throughout all of the sects is radically declining. And particularly just in the last 10, 20 years, and especially among younger people in their 20s, teens, 20s, 30s. So I'm going to ask you a really, really hard question. Can we have a post-ecclesial Christianity as we look to the future? Or is there a way for the churches to redefine their missions to speak to the hearts and needs and souls of all of these needy people?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we are social people, and Christianity exists in churches, but that doesn't say what form those would be. I think over time it can change in a variety of ways, and we see that happening. And some of the more dynamic churches are very different from traditional denominations. To the point of why so many young people are turning away from the church, I do think, I wrote an article a couple of years ago called "The Political Captivity of the Faithful." And I think on both sides, progressive and conservative, deeply held political conviction have completely washed over the church. And I can say that about sort of mainline progressives on a certain agenda, and I can say that broadly about many evangelicals and even Catholics. And I think the church, if it's going to be lively, has to shed it's got to make sure that its convictions are flowing we're all subject to the climate of opinion that we're in. But I just think the dominant categories today are these deep politically held views that overwhelm anything that's distinctly Christian. And I think that turns off a lot of young people.
All right, we've got a couple of student questions here in the back. Sorry, I haven't meant to neglect the back, just working our way back towards it.
Hi, I'm a graduate student, and looking at the academic job market recently, I've been distressed at the transience it seems to require. You have to move anywhere you can get a job or take a 2-year postdoc and then move somewhere else. And I noticed that you spend a long time at a couple institutions, and I guess I'm just curious how you think about committing to a place in a community versus the requirements of the academic job market.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perilous thing to become an academic, at least in certain fields. And it's never, even in my lifetime, it's never been that good. I mean, when I finished my PhD, there were 4 jobs in American history, early American history in the whole country, and probably 75 good people sloshing around for them. And so I think particularly when one is young, one does have to think of moving. I mean, I did 2 postdocs with wonderful experiences, but we had to move. So landing the first tenure track position, I think that's a huge challenge. When that happens, then one has to decide. I was very privileged to be at a place like Notre Dame. It sort of fulfilled any ambition I would have as a teacher and a scholar, although it was, as a Southern evangelical Protestant, there was a lot to learn at a place like Notre Dame, but they were very welcoming to us. As an administrator, there are certain patterns that people move around like every 5 years. That's never been attractive to me. I tend to think you have to accomplish certain things takes time. And I feel privileged to have been able to serve at 2 places.
All right, and another student question.
So given your work as a historian, how has studying past leaders, secular or Christian, influenced you as a leader?
I mean, I do think being a historian sort of helps in administration. You see many different kinds of people, many different kinds of leaders. You're not shocked when you see the underside of the tapestry, the way people behave, because that's one of the challenges of administration. You see how petty, how selfish, how hard it is to keep this overall institution as in harmony and moving forward. But the study of the past shows that we tend to idealize how things were. And if you study any era or any movement, whatever, things aren't worse today. People have always, organizations have always struggled. And so anyhow, that certainly has helped me, I think, navigate administrative challenges.
We're coming up on 7:45, so I think we might need to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. Is there one last audience question? Anybody who we haven't gotten to, who has a burning question? All right, I'll ask a concluding question in that case. So Dr. Hatch, lots of different demographics here, lots of different age groups, but our heart especially goes out for undergrad students. And so if reflecting on your life, your career, thinking back to yourself as a undergrad student at Wheaton, if you had just kind of parting advice or words of wisdom gleaned from life that you would want to tell current undergraduate college students, or thinking about the way you would pray for your students at Wake Forest as a Christian for your undergrad students, what would your hope or your prayer or your kind of parting words of advice be for 18 to 22-year-olds?
One is you can't plan your career, or if you do, it will not be very good. My wife, Julie, has always said the most important things that ever happened to us came as a surprise. Even my going into administration or ending up at Notre Dame or coming to Wake Forest. And so you try to be faithful at what you're doing and hopeful for the future. So that's one thing. Don't think you can sort of scheme, in 10 years I want to be here. It won't work that way. And so don't worry about it. The other thing is try to become good at something. I find certain students who it's wonderful. Their interests are so broad and they sort of want to dabble in this and that and the other, but it is helpful to have, to use in this context, a good basketball metaphor, to have some move, Can you drive? Can you shoot the jump shot? I mean, sometimes, okay, you think you want to go to law and you start that and that may not work out, or into medicine, or in my case, I said, okay, I'll start graduate school. That seems logical. I love that. And it went that way, but we do live in a society of specialists, and having something that you do well is really, really helpful. I mean, I've said this before, but the final thing is to take some time. By the time you finish college, you really don't know who you are. You have certain, when I finished college, I knew I wanted to accomplish things. I didn't know how talented I was, what my future would be. You sort of have to live for a while. And so I guess in conclusion, don't think you have to have it all figured out when you graduate. Take joy in what you're studying and who your friends are, what your next step may be, and work hard at what you're called to.
Wise words. Could we give a round of applause to thank Madison and Dr. Hatch for being here tonight? So we're going to ask Madison to close us in prayer here in just a moment. But before we do, Dr. Hatch introduced basketball metaphors. As some of you may know, Wake Forest slightly had the upper hand on UNC this year in the regular season. They beat us soundly. Alondis Williams from Wake Forest won ACC Player of the Year over Armando Bacot, very controversial. But UNC is still playing this weekend in the Final Four. Woo! Wake Forest is no longer, so we got Dr. Hatch a parting gift. This is a UNC Final Four official T-shirt for Dr. Hatch. Yes. So Dr. Hatch is an honorary Tar Heel for this weekend. So yes, and we're assuming you want UNC to win over Duke, correct?
I do.
He's on record. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. There's plenty of food in the back, so eat some on your way out. If you're an undergrad, I want to invite you to stay for a little bit and help us pick up chairs if you can. I know some of you have to run to class. If you're an adult guest, please don't worry about that. But if you're an undergrad, we'll take your help. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for braving the weather. I'm going to hand it to Madison, who's going to pray for us to close.
Thank you. Let us pray. Father, thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for the gift of being alive this very moment together in the same room. We thank you for the lived witness of Dr. Nathan Hatch, of his family, and of his life journey. And we pray that we might also live lives where somebody looking on could see your son at work. Please draw us unto you. And we all join together in prayer for Carolina on Saturday night for a victory. Amen.